In March 2010, 3 forest towns in northern Michigan reported coordinated attacks by packs of creatures that walked upright and hunted like wolves. Law enforcement dismissed the claims until officers themselves witnessed the attacks. By the time federal agents arrived to investigate, 17 people were dead and entire families had abandoned their homes. I was a state police detective assigned to the case, and what I saw in those woods violated every natural law I thought I understood. The official report was sealed and classified as mass hysteria, but the truth is far more disturbing. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The first call came on March 7th from a homeowner in Kalkaska County reporting that something had killed his livestock. Dispatch logged it as a routine wildlife complaint and sent a conservation officer to investigate. The officer arrived at dawn to find 8 sheep torn apart in a pen with 12-foot fencing. The kills were brutal and excessive, far more damage than any predator would inflict for food. The fence showed no signs of breach, no holes or damaged sections, yet the gate remained latched from the outside. The officer noted in his report that the attack pattern suggested multiple large predators working together, but he could not identify the species from the tracks in the mud. Within 48 hours, similar reports flooded in from 3 towns within a 20-mile radius. Livestock killed in locked pens, pets disappearing from fenced yards, strange vocalizations in the forests at night that sounded like wolf howls mixed with something almost human. Residents described seeing large shapes moving through the trees on 2 legs, standing 7 or 8 feet tall with broad shoulders and elongated snouts. Most dismissed these sightings as panic and imagination, the product of rural isolation and fear feeding on itself. The Conservation Department attributed the attacks to a pack of wolves that had migrated from Canada, though no wolves had been documented in that region for over 50 years. On March 12th, the situation escalated. A postal carrier disappeared on his rural route between the towns of Mansalona and Bel Air. His truck was found idling on the shoulder of a forest road with the door open and his mailbag on the ground. The engine was still running, the keys in the ignition, and his coffee cup sat in the holder still warm. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the vehicle except for unusual prints in the soft shoulder. The responding deputy described the prints as larger than any bear print he had seen, with visible claw marks and a stride pattern that suggested bipedal movement. Search teams combed the forest for 3 days. They found his hat hanging from a branch 8 feet off the ground, torn and bloodied. 50 yards deeper into the woods, they found more blood, enough to suggest fatal trauma, but no body. The search dogs refused to track beyond that point, sitting down and whining despite commands from their handlers. One dog handler, a veteran with 15 years of search and rescue experience, reported that his dog showed the same behavior he had seen only once before when tracking near an active bear den with cubs. The dogs were not detecting injury or death, but immediate physical danger, the scent of an active predator close enough to pose a threat. That same evening, 3 teenagers camping in the Manistee National Forest reported an encounter that would set the pattern for everything that followed. They were at an established campsite, the kind families use in summer with cleared ground and a fire ring. Around midnight, they heard movement in the trees surrounding their tent, something large walking in a circle around them. They assumed it was a bear and made noise to scare it away, banging pots and shouting. The movement stopped, and they waited in silence for several minutes. Then a vocalization began that they described as halfway between a wolf howl and human speech, rising and falling in pitch with distinct pauses as if multiple animals were communicating back and forth. The sounds came from different directions, suggesting at least 3 or 4 individuals coordinating their positions around the campsite. One of the teenagers turned on a flashlight and swept it across the tree line. The beam caught eyes reflecting green approximately 7 feet off the ground, too high for any quadruped. The eyes did not blink or look away but held steady, watching. Then more eyes appeared in different positions, creating a semicircle around the tent. The teenagers abandoned their gear and ran for their car parked a quarter-mile away on the access road. They reported hearing heavy footfalls behind them, something large moving through the underbrush at high speed, keeping pace with their sprint. They reached the car, started the engine, and drove straight to the county sheriff's office without stopping. When deputies returned to the campsite at dawn, they found the tent shredded as if by large claws, the sleeping bags torn apart, and the food cache scattered. The fire ring had been disturbed, and the logs were scattered in a pattern that suggested deliberate destruction rather than animal curiosity. The sheriff called the state police, and that is when I got involved. My name does not matter anymore. What I saw in those woods matters more than who I was before or after. I arrived in Kalkaska on March 14th with another detective and 2 uniformed troopers. The briefing from local law enforcement was chaotic, filled with contradictory witness statements and speculation about everything from rabid wolves to mass delusion. The consensus among the deputies was that fear had spread through these isolated communities, and people were seeing things that were not there, that normal animal behavior was being interpreted through a lens of panic. I wanted to believe that explanation because it was rational and it fit within the framework of normal criminal investigation. We established a command post at the Kalkaska County Sheriff's Office and began systematically interviewing witnesses and examining physical evidence. The livestock kills showed consistent patterns that troubled me. The victims were killed with massive trauma to the neck and chest. Bite marks that forensics estimated came from jaws at least 12 inches wide with canine teeth 3 inches long. The bite force required to inflict that damage exceeded anything documented for wolves or bears. More disturbing was the selective nature of the kills. Predators kill for food and typically consume their prey or cache it for later. These animals were killing far more than they could eat, leaving carcasses to rot and returning night after night to kill again in the same locations. The behavior suggested either territorial aggression or something that enjoyed the act of killing separate from any need for sustenance. On our second night in Kalkaska, we received a call from a residence on the outskirts of town. A woman reported seeing multiple large figures moving through her backyard toward her neighbor's house. We arrived within 10 minutes, lights off and weapons drawn. The street was dark. Most residents had already evacuated to stay with family in larger towns, and the houses sat empty with porch lights on and nothing moving. We parked and approached on foot, using flashlights to scan the yards and tree line. The neighbor's house showed signs of attempted entry. Deep scratches marked the back door, gouges in the wood that penetrated a 1/4 inch deep. A window had been shattered from the outside, glass scattered across the kitchen floor. We entered and cleared the house room by room, finding it empty but thoroughly ransacked. The destruction was methodical. Cabinets opened and contents pulled out, furniture overturned, closets emptied onto the floor. But nothing was stolen. Electronics remained in place, jewelry boxes untouched, cash left in drawers. Whatever had broken in was not searching for valuables, but for something else, possibly for people hiding. We found tracks in the backyard, the same oversized prints with visible claws that had been reported at other scenes. The tracks led into the forest behind the property, and we followed them for approximately 50 yards before my flashlight caught movement ahead. Something large shifted between the trees, low to the ground at first, then rising to full height. The beam illuminated matted fur, a powerful torso, and a head that was distinctly canine but positioned on a neck that allowed it to look forward like a human rather than down like a wolf. The eyes reflected green in the light and held steady, staring directly at us with obvious intelligence and intent. I drew my service weapon and called out a command to freeze, following protocol even though I knew it was absurd. The creature did not freeze. It made a sound that started as a growl deep in its chest and rose into something that sounded like human words, a vocalization so wrong that my brain refused to process it as language, even though the pattern suggested speech. Then it dropped to all fours and ran, moving with incredible speed through dense undergrowth that would have slowed any normal animal. We heard it crashing through the forest, and then we heard answering calls from at least 2 other locations, the same hybrid howl speech that the teenagers had described. We retreated to our vehicle and called for backup, requesting canine units and additional officers with rifles. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, we had 20 officers on scene with spotlights and thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the State Emergency Management Agency. The thermal scans showed heat signatures moving through the forest in patterns that confirmed our worst suspicions. There were at least 7 distinct individuals, moving in coordinated formation, flanking our position while maintaining distance. They were not running away, but circling, staying just outside the range of our lights, while maintaining visual contact with our team. The behavior was tactical and deliberate, the kind of movement you would expect from intelligent predators, assessing their opposition and planning an attack. We held position for 3 hours, weapons ready, waiting for a rush that never came. As dawn approached, the thermal signatures withdrew deeper into the forest and disappeared. The sun rose on March 15th to reveal a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. 7 more families had abandoned their homes overnight, leaving belongings behind and driving to shelters in Traverse City. The schools in all 3 affected towns closed indefinitely. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about a wolf pack terrorizing the region, and the comments section filled with residents claiming to have seen creatures that walked upright and showed signs of intelligence far beyond normal animal behavior. State wildlife officials held a press conference denying the existence of any unusual predator and attributing the reports to coyotes or possibly a small number of wolves behaving abnormally due to disease or starvation. The press conference did nothing to calm the panic. That afternoon, we organized a sweep of the forest with 40 officers, conservation officers, and volunteers from local hunting clubs. The plan was to establish a line and move through the woods systematically, documenting any evidence we found and hopefully identifying the animals responsible. We entered the forest at 2 in the afternoon under clear skies with good visibility. The sweep progressed slowly, the line maintaining formation as we moved through dense stands of pine and hardwood. We found numerous tracks, all matching the pattern we had documented previously, and several areas where something large had bedded down in the underbrush. We found the remains of a deer that had been killed recently and partially consumed, the carcass showing the same massive bite trauma we had seen on the livestock. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, the forest grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Birds stopped calling. The constant background noise of small animals moving through leaves and branches ceased entirely. The silence pressed down with physical weight, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up in response to some stimulus I could not consciously identify. The line of officers slowed and stopped without orders, everyone sensing that something had changed. Then we heard the howls, starting from a single point ahead of us and spreading in a wave across our front. The vocalizations came from at least 20 distinct locations, far more individuals than we had estimated. They were not random calls, but coordinated communication, each howl slightly different in pitch and rhythm, conveying information across the pack. The commander ordered us to hold position and prepare for contact. We formed a defensive line with weapons ready, every officer scanning the tree line for movement. The howls continued for several minutes, drawing closer, and then stopped abruptly, leaving total silence. I counted my heartbeats and tried to slow my breathing, hands steady on my weapon despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Movement came from our left flank, something large breaking cover and running parallel to our line, approximately 50 yards out, then another on our right, matching speed. They were flanking us using tactics that showed clear understanding of how to divide and overwhelm an opposing force. The commander ordered a tactical withdrawal, pulling back toward our vehicles while maintaining formation and covering our retreat with overlapping fields of fire. The creatures harried us for the entire withdrawal, never attacking directly but maintaining pressure, running parallel to our line, and occasionally rushing forward just close enough to create panic before retreating back into cover. I caught glimpses of them moving between trees, upright figures covered in dark fur with elongated snouts and ears that pointed upward like a German shepherd's. Their movement was fluid, switching from bipedal to quadrupedal locomotion depending on terrain and speed requirements. They used the cover brilliantly, exposing themselves only for seconds before disappearing behind trees or dropping into depressions. Several officers fired warning shots, aiming above the creatures in an attempt to scare them off. The gunfire had no effect. If anything, it seemed to excite them, prompting more aggressive rushes and louder vocalizations. We reached our vehicles as darkness fell. Every officer accounted for, but badly shaken. I had been a police officer for 12 years, served in the military before that, and faced armed suspects without experiencing the level of primal fear I felt during that withdrawal. These were not animals operating on instinct. These were intelligent beings using sophisticated tactics to intimidate and hurt us. They had allowed us to leave, could have attacked at any point during our retreat, but chose not to, and that choice suggested planning and restraint that no animal should possess. I reported these observations to my superiors that evening, and recommended immediate evacuation of all civilians from the affected area and deployment of specialized tracking teams with equipment designed for large predator control. My recommendation was noted but not implemented. The first death occurred that night. A deputy sheriff conducting a patrol of abandoned properties found a house with its front door torn off the hinges. He called for backup and entered the residence with his weapon drawn. He found a family of 4 in the upstairs bedrooms, killed within the last hour based on body temperature. The scene was devastating. Massive trauma consistent with the attacks on livestock, and evidence that the family had tried to barricade themselves in the rooms before the creatures broke through. The deputy was still on scene when he heard movement downstairs. He took a defensive position at the top of the stairs and called out, announcing his presence and ordering whoever was down there to show themselves. The response was a howl that shook the walls, followed by heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. The deputy fired 3 rounds down the stairwell, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. He heard something large retreat back down the stairs and out through the front door. He maintained his position until backup arrived 20 minutes later. We found bullet impacts in the stairwell wall, blood spatter on the steps consistent with at least 1 hit, and a trail of blood leading out of the house and into the forest. The blood was canine, DNA analysis later confirmed, but with chromosomal abnormalities that the forensics team could not explain. The deputy's statement was consistent and detailed, describing a creature that moved on 2 legs with a hunched posture, covered in dark fur with a wolfish head and eyes that reflected his flashlight beam. He estimated its height at 7 feet and its weight at over 300 pounds based on the sound of its footfalls on the wooden stairs. By dawn on March 16th, the situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of local containment. We had 4 more deaths overnight, 2 deputies injured during encounters with the creatures, and complete evacuation of the civilian population from a 15-mile radius. The governor declared a state of emergency and deployed National Guard units to establish a perimeter around the affected area. Federal agencies arrived, starting with the Department of Natural Resources, and then escalating to branches I could not identify, men in unmarked vehicles with credentials that got them access to every level of the investigation. They took over the command post, reviewed all our evidence and witness statements, and told us to cease all operations in the forest until their team completed an assessment. I was ordered to turn over all my notes and photographs and sign a non-disclosure agreement that threatened federal prosecution if I discussed the case with anyone outside the official investigation. I refused to sign initially, arguing that the public had a right to know about a threat to their safety. My captain took me aside and explained in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that I would sign the agreement or lose my badge and face obstruction charges. I signed. The federal team went into the forest with equipment I had never seen before: electronic monitoring devices, specialized weapons, and tracking technology that seemed designed for a specific target rather than general wildlife management. They established observation posts throughout the forest, installed motion-activated cameras, and deployed what appeared to be acoustic sensors to map the creature's movements and communication patterns. For 3 days, nothing happened. The creatures went silent. No howls, no attacks, no movement detected by any of the monitoring equipment. The forest appeared completely empty of wildlife. Even normal animals like deer and rabbits seemed to have evacuated the area. The federal team maintained their observation posts and continued scanning with thermal imaging, finding nothing larger than raccoons. The commander of the federal operation held a briefing on March 19th and announced that the situation had been resolved, that the pack had moved on or dispersed, and that residents could begin returning to their homes within 48 hours, pending final safety inspections. I did not believe it. The silence felt wrong, felt like the held breath before a scream rather than the calm after a storm. That night, the attacks resumed with coordinated precision that suggested the creatures had been watching and learning from the federal response. They hit 4 locations simultaneously, all of them federal observation posts on the perimeter of the monitored zone. The posts were fortified positions with clear sightlines and multiple officers on duty, designed to be defensible against any wildlife threat. The creatures overran them in minutes. I listened to the radio traffic as it happened, officers calling for backup and reporting contact with multiple large hostiles, gunfire, screaming, and then silence as each post went dark in succession. Quick reaction teams responded and found the positions completely destroyed, equipment smashed, and officers dead or missing. The few survivors described a coordinated assault from multiple directions, creatures attacking in waves, while others flanked and cut off escape routes. One federal agent survived long enough to give a statement before he succumbed to his injuries. He described creatures that communicated with each other during the attack using a combination of vocalizations and what appeared to be hand signals, gestures that directed individuals to specific positions or targets. He said they avoided certain officers who carried specific weapons while focusing attacks on others, suggesting they could identify which firearms posed the greatest threat. He said they showed no fear of gunfire, rushing forward through volleys that should have stopped any animal, and only withdrew when faced with fire from the few officers carrying high-powered rifles capable of stopping large game. His account was classified immediately, but I heard it firsthand before the federal team restricted access to all witness statements. The federal commander ordered a complete withdrawal. All remaining personnel pulled back to Traverse City, establishing a new perimeter 30 miles from the original site. Residents were told that the evacuation area was being expanded due to concerns about rabies transmission, and that return would not be authorized until the situation was fully resolved. The official story shifted to a rabid wolf pack, a natural if tragic occurrence that required professional wildlife management to address safely. The media accepted this explanation with minimal questioning, running stories about the dangers of wildlife diseases and interviewing experts who discussed wolf behavior in detail. None of the stories mentioned the coordinated tactics, the apparent intelligence, or the systematic destruction of fortified positions by creatures that showed understanding of modern weaponry and defensive tactics. I remained on duty through March but was effectively sidelined, assigned to administrative tasks and kept away from any ongoing field operations. I spent my time reviewing every piece of evidence I had collected before the federal takeover, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. The patterns were undeniable once you looked at them objectively. The creatures hunted in packs of 7 to 20 individuals, maintained territorial boundaries that they defended aggressively, and showed clear hierarchical organization with some individuals directing others during attacks. They avoided camera traps consistently, suggesting they could identify electronic equipment. They preferentially attacked isolated individuals and small groups while avoiding confrontations with large forces, at least initially, and they demonstrated tool use, using rocks and branches to test fences and doors before attempting to breach them. The most disturbing evidence came from acoustic analysis of their vocalizations. A wildlife biologist I had consulted early in the investigation before the federal takeover analyzed recordings we had captured in the field. She identified structures in their calls that showed grammatical patterns, repeated sequences that appeared in different contexts with slight variations suggesting syntax or meaning. She compared the vocalizations to recordings of wolves, coyotes, and other canids, finding similarities in the base sounds but complexity far beyond anything documented in wild animals. Her conclusion, which she delivered with obvious reluctance, was that the creatures possessed some form of language, a communication system sophisticated enough to convey specific information and coordinate group behavior through abstract planning rather than simple instinct. She refused to put that conclusion in writing and stopped returning my calls after the federal team interviewed her. On March 23rd, the federal team announced success. They claimed to have located and eliminated the pack responsible for the attacks, presenting physical evidence that included bodies of 3 large canids shot during an operation in the deep forest. The bodies were displayed briefly for media photography, shown from carefully controlled angles that emphasized their wolf-like features, while obscuring their size and the unusual structure of their forelimbs. The photographs showed animals that could plausibly be mistaken for large wolves by anyone who did not examine them closely. Residents were told they could begin returning to their homes immediately, that the threat had been eliminated, and normal life could resume. The evacuation order was lifted, and most people started trickling back to their properties over the following week. But the attacks did not stop. They decreased in frequency and changed in character, becoming more cautious and selective, but they continued. Livestock kills resumed within days of residents returning. Pets disappeared from yards despite security measures. Hikers reported encounters with large animals that followed them on trails, maintaining distance but clearly tracking their movements. The reports were dismissed as residual anxiety or misidentification of normal wildlife. The federal team maintained a small presence in the area, monitoring reports and investigating incidents quietly without media attention. The official position remained that the threat had been eliminated, and any ongoing issues represented normal wildlife activity. I was transferred to a different district in May and told that my continued presence in the area was counterproductive to the recovery process. My transfer was not presented as disciplinary, but the message was clear. I had seen too much, asked too many questions, and my presence reminded people of events that everyone, from local officials to federal agencies, wanted to forget. I completed my transfer and spent the next several years working routine cases in a quiet district where the most dangerous thing I encountered was drunk drivers and domestic disputes. I tried to forget what I had seen in those Michigan forests, tried to convince myself that the official explanations made sense if you did not look too closely at the inconsistencies and contradictions. I retired from the state police in 2016, taking early retirement on medical grounds after years of struggling with nightmares and anxiety that no amount of therapy seemed to resolve. The non-disclosure agreement I signed technically remains in effect, binding me to silence about classified aspects of the investigation. But I am old now, past 70, and the agreement specified penalties that seem meaningless at this stage of my life. I am choosing to break my silence because people deserve to know what happened in those towns, and because the creatures are still there. Reports of encounters continue from that region of Michigan, though they are carefully downplayed or attributed to normal wildlife by authorities who know better. Hunters who venture deep into the forests occasionally go missing, searches find evidence of predation, and the cases are closed with minimal investigation. I do not know what these creatures are or where they came from. The DNA evidence was inconclusive, showing characteristics of canids but with genetic markers that did not match any known species. Some of the federal agents whispered theories about undocumented apex predators, evolutionary holdovers from the Pleistocene that had survived in isolated populations. Others suggested something worse, experiments or mutations, though they provided no details and shut down any discussion of such possibilities. What I do know with certainty is that they exist, they are intelligent, and they view humans as competitors for territory or possibly as prey. They learned from their encounters with law enforcement, adapted their tactics to counter our responses, and demonstrated patience and planning that exceeded anything I had seen in my years dealing with human criminals. The forest towns of northern Michigan continue to struggle with population decline and economic hardship. Property values crashed after the events of 2010 and never fully recovered. Many families who evacuated never returned, selling their homes at losses or simply abandoning them to foreclosure. The communities that remain are shadows of what they were before, smaller and more isolated, surrounded by forests that feel threatening rather than peaceful. Local residents do not talk about what happened, even among themselves. There is an unspoken agreement to maintain the official story, to accept the explanation of rabid wolves rather than confront a reality that defies rational explanation. But they know. Every resident who lived through those weeks in March knows that something walks in their forests that should not exist, something that watches and waits and occasionally kills. when the conditions are right. I have devoted considerable time since my retirement to researching similar incidents across North America. The pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. Remote communities experience waves of livestock predation and missing persons cases. Investigations find evidence of large predators operating in coordinated packs. Witnesses describe bipedal creatures with canine features and signs of intelligence, and authorities dismiss the reports as exaggeration or misidentification while quietly implementing containment measures. The incidents cluster in forested regions with low population density, areas where a large predator population could exist without regular contact with humans. The creatures appear territorial, generally avoiding human settlements until provoked by intrusion into their range or until population pressure forces them into contact with civilization. The Michigan incident stands out for its scale and the level of organization the creatures displayed. Most reports involve single individuals or small packs engaging in opportunistic predation. The Michigan pack demonstrated sophisticated tactics and sustained aggression over multiple weeks, suggesting either a larger population or an unusually aggressive group. The fact that they successfully drove out human inhabitants from a substantial territory, even temporarily, indicates capabilities that should concern anyone involved in wildlife management or public safety. But the official response has been consistent denial and suppression, a pattern that continues to this day. Agencies have developed protocols for handling such incidents, protocols that prioritize containment of information over protection of the public. I encourage anyone reading this to research the events of March 2010 in Kalkaska, Antrim, and Grand Traverse counties. You will find news archives describing a rabies outbreak in the wolf population and the unfortunate deaths of 17 people attributed to wildlife encounters. You will not find mention of coordinated attacks, intelligent tactics, or the systematic destruction of federal observation posts. Those details were classified and removed from public record. But you can find the gaps in the official narrative, the inconsistencies that do not make sense if you assume normal predator behavior. You can find the property records showing mass abandonment of homes. You can find the statistics showing population decline that far exceeds normal demographic trends. The evidence remains for anyone willing to look beyond the sanitized official story. To those who live in or near forested regions where such incidents have been reported, I offer this advice drawn from hard experience. Do not venture into remote forest areas alone, particularly at night or during dawn and dusk when predators are most active. If you encounter large tracks or signs of recent predation, leave the area immediately and report it to authorities even if you expect your report to be dismissed. If you hear unusual vocalizations in the forest, howls that sound partially human or that seem to come from multiple directions in coordinated patterns, do not investigate and do not assume it is simply coyotes or wolves. Move to safety and avoid the area. These creatures are intelligent enough to set ambushes and patient enough to stalk prey over long distances. Your safety depends on recognizing the danger and responding appropriately before you find yourself in a situation where escape is no longer possible. I am aware that many readers will dismiss this account as fabrication or delusion, the product of trauma or sensationalism. I cannot prove the truth of what I witnessed beyond presenting the facts as I experienced them and encouraging independent verification of the publicly available evidence. But I know what I saw in those Michigan forests during March 2010. I know the fear I felt facing creatures that should not exist. I know the frustration of being forced to participate in a cover-up designed to protect institutional interests rather than public safety. And I know that somewhere in the forests of northern Michigan, those creatures still hunt and watch and wait, and the occasional disappearance or unsolved death represents their continued presence in an ecosystem that has not successfully contained or eliminated them. The breakthrough in my understanding of these creatures came from an unexpected source several years after the initial incidents. A wildlife biologist who had worked briefly on the federal investigation team before being dismissed contacted me through an intermediary. We met in a neutral location, a diner in a town far from Michigan, where she shared documentation she had copied before being forced to turn over all her research materials. The documents included DNA analysis that had never been made public, anatomical sketches based on examination of tissue samples, and behavioral observations compiled from months of covert monitoring that continued long after the official investigation ended. The picture that emerged was far more complex and disturbing than anything I had imagined during my time on the case. The creatures were not simply large predatory canids, but represented something that defied easy classification within existing taxonomic systems. Their skeletal structure showed characteristics of both canids and primates, with a spine capable of supporting fully upright posture and hip joints that allowed for efficient bipedal locomotion. Their forelimbs possessed a degree of manual dexterity that approached but did not equal that of primates, with partially opposable thumbs and the ability to grasp and manipulate objects with precision. Their brain cases were substantially larger than those of wolves, with cranial capacity that suggested intelligence potentially approaching that of great apes. Most disturbing were the vocal structures, which included elements found in both canids and in species capable of more complex vocalizations, anatomical features that would enable the kind of sophisticated communication that had been documented in field recordings. The biologist presented several theories about the origin of these creatures, none of them entirely satisfying. One hypothesis suggested they represented an undiscovered branch of canid evolution that had developed along a path parallel to that of primates, converging on similar solutions to environmental pressures through different genetic mechanisms. Another theory, which she admitted was more speculative, suggested these creatures might be survivors of a Pleistocene species that had gone undetected in remote forest regions for thousands of years, maintaining small populations and avoiding contact with humans through learned behavior passed down through generations. A third possibility, which she discussed only reluctantly and with numerous caveats, was that the creatures represented something that had been deliberately created, either through selective breeding programs or through more direct genetic manipulation, though she had no evidence to support such claims, and emphasized that this remained pure speculation. What was not speculation was the evidence of their population structure and territorial behavior. The monitoring data showed that the Michigan population, which the federal team estimated at between 40 and 60 individuals, was organized into 3 distinct packs with overlapping but generally respected territorial boundaries. Each pack appeared to be led by a dominant pair with a clear hierarchy determining access to food resources and breeding opportunities. The packs communicated across territorial boundaries through vocalizations and scent marking, coordinating their movements in ways that suggested information sharing about resources and threats. During the March incidents, all 3 packs had mobilized simultaneously in response to the increased human presence, demonstrating a level of intergroup cooperation that is rare in territorial predators. This coordination suggested either strong social bonds extending across pack boundaries, or a threat recognition system sophisticated enough to override normal competitive instincts. The biologist also shared disturbing evidence about the creature's learning capabilities. The federal monitoring team had documented rapid adaptation to human tactics and technology over the course of the investigation. Early in the incident, the creatures had approached occupied buildings and vehicles with curiosity and minimal caution. Within days, they learned to identify active surveillance equipment and avoided camera locations while continuing to operate in monitored areas. They developed counter-tactics to human defensive measures, learning that chain-link fences could be climbed or undermined, that dogs could be intimidated through vocalizations alone, and that human groups with rifles posed more danger than those with handguns or shotguns. By the end of the incident, they were demonstrating behaviors that suggested active testing of human responses, probing defenses at multiple locations simultaneously to identify weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armed positions. Perhaps most concerning was evidence that the creatures showed understanding of human temporal patterns and used that knowledge to their advantage. They adjusted their activity schedules to avoid peak human presence, concentrating attacks during shift changes when security was transitional, and demonstrating what appeared to be awareness of human communication systems by timing attacks to occur when they knew response times would be delayed. One incident involved a coordinated assault on an observation post that coincided precisely with a severe weather event that grounded helicopter support and slowed ground response units. The timing could have been coincidence, but the biologist's analysis suggested the creatures had learned to associate certain weather patterns with reduced human mobility and had adjusted their tactics accordingly. This level of strategic planning indicated cognitive abilities that far exceeded anything documented in non-human species outside of the great apes. I asked the biologist why she was sharing this information with me, why she was willing to violate her own non-disclosure agreement and risk the legal consequences. Her answer was simple and devastating. The federal containment strategy was failing. The Michigan population was growing, not shrinking. Monitoring data showed successful breeding in all 3 packs over the past several years, with juvenile survival rates that suggested the population could double within a decade. More troubling, there was evidence of dispersal, young adults leaving their natal packs and establishing territories in adjacent forest regions. Sightings and incidents consistent with the creature's presence had been reported from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, suggesting a range expansion that could bring them into contact with far larger human populations. The official policy of denial and quiet containment was becoming untenable as the geographic scope of the problem grew beyond the capacity of covert monitoring teams to manage. The biologist believed that public disclosure was necessary before a major incident forced the issue under circumstances that would create mass panic. She argued that controlled release of information, properly managed through scientific channels with appropriate context and safety recommendations, would allow communities to prepare and protect themselves while avoiding the chaos that would follow a catastrophic encounter. She was preparing a scientific paper documenting her findings and intended to submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, despite the legal risks. She wanted my corroboration as a law enforcement witness to strengthen her case and to provide documentation from a different perspective. I agreed to provide a statement summarizing my observations and to support her effort in whatever way I could without directly violating my own agreement. I do not know if she ever published her paper. She stopped responding to communications several months after our meeting, and my attempts to locate her through professional channels were unsuccessful. In the years since those conversations, I have watched the situation evolve exactly as she predicted. Reports of encounters have increased across the upper Midwest and into northern New England. The incidents follow predictable patterns: livestock predation, missing persons cases in remote recreational areas, and occasional sightings by credible witnesses who describe creatures that matched the Michigan specimens in every detail. Each incident is investigated quietly by federal teams that arrive, gather evidence, issue official explanations attributing the events to known wildlife, and depart, leaving local communities confused and frightened. The pattern of denial continues even as the evidence accumulates and the geographic range of the problem expands. At some point, the scale of the situation will exceed the capacity of covert management. When that happens, the response will be reactive rather than proactive, driven by crisis rather than planning, and people will die who could have been protected by honest disclosure and proper preparation. The story of Michigan's siege by Dogman packs in 2010 did not end with the federal declaration of success in March. The creatures remain, their population status unknown, their true nature still not scientifically documented in any public database. They continue to influence the human communities on the periphery of their territory, shaping settlement patterns and land use through fear rather than direct confrontation. They exist in a strange liminal space, too well documented to be dismissed as folklore but too officially denied to be addressed through normal wildlife management channels. Future incidents seem inevitable as human expansion continues to encroach on remaining wilderness areas. How authorities will respond to those incidents, whether they will maintain the pattern of denial and suppression, or finally acknowledge the reality of these creatures, remains to be seen. But the truth cannot remain hidden forever, and eventually the weight of accumulated evidence will force a reckoning with what we share these forests with. I have also devoted considerable time to researching historical accounts that might provide context for the modern incidents. Indigenous peoples across North America have traditions describing creatures that match the characteristics we documented in Michigan. These accounts predate European contact and appear across multiple cultures with remarkable consistency despite geographic separation. The creatures are described as powerful predators that walk on two legs, hunt in packs, and possess near-human intelligence. Some traditions describe them as dangerous but natural beings that can be avoided through proper respect and caution. Others assign supernatural characteristics, suggesting the creatures exist on a boundary between the natural and spiritual worlds. While I remain skeptical of supernatural explanations, the consistency of these historical accounts across cultures suggests the creatures have been part of the North American ecosystem for a very long time, and that indigenous peoples developed knowledge and protocols for coexistence that have been lost or dismissed by modern society. European accounts are more fragmentary but equally intriguing. Frontier journals from the 18th and 19th centuries occasionally mention encounters with beasts that do not fit known species, described as wolves that walked upright or bears that moved with unnatural intelligence. Most of these accounts were dismissed as tall tales or misidentifications of known animals, but when examined systematically, they reveal a pattern of reports concentrated in heavily forested regions during periods of frontier expansion, precisely the conditions that would bring European settlers into contact with creatures that had previously avoided human habitation. The reports declined dramatically with the clearing of forests and expansion of settlement, suggesting the creatures retreated into remaining wilderness areas where contact with humans became increasingly rare. The modern resurgence of reports correlates with reforestation efforts and the establishment of protected wilderness areas that have created suitable habitat for large predators. This historical perspective suggests several uncomfortable conclusions. First, the creatures are not a new phenomenon, but a long-established part of the North American fauna that has simply avoided scientific documentation through a combination of low population density, habitat preferences that minimize human contact, and possibly learned avoidance behaviors. Second, they have demonstrated the ability to coexist with human populations as long as sufficient wilderness remains to support their territorial requirements and hunting patterns. Third, the increasing frequency of encounters represents not a sudden appearance of a new species, but the result of habitat compression as human development encroaches on remaining wilderness areas, forcing the creatures into closer proximity with human settlements. Understanding these patterns is crucial for developing effective management strategies that protect both human communities and the creatures themselves. The question of how to manage a large, intelligent predator that preys occasionally on humans poses unprecedented challenges for wildlife management agencies and legal frameworks. Traditional approaches to problem predators involve either relocation to suitable habitat or lethal removal if the threat to human safety is deemed unacceptable. Neither approach seems appropriate or practical for creatures that demonstrate intelligence approaching that of great apes, and that occupy territories in regions where relocation options do not exist. Lethal removal on a scale sufficient to eliminate or substantially reduce the population would require a campaign that would be difficult to justify legally or ethically, particularly given the uncertain taxonomic status of the creatures and the possibility that they represent a unique species deserving of conservation protection. The situation demands entirely new frameworks for thinking about human-wildlife coexistence in cases where the wildlife possesses capabilities that challenge our assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal. Some researchers have suggested that the creatures should be afforded protections similar to those given to endangered great apes, with recognition of their intelligence and complex social structures. This approach would require habitat preservation and strict limitations on human activities in core territory areas, essentially creating exclusion zones where human presence would be minimized and monitored. Critics argue that protecting predators that pose a threat to human life and property represents an unacceptable prioritization of wildlife over human safety. The debate remains largely theoretical because official acknowledgement of the creature's existence has not occurred, making formal management frameworks impossible to implement. Meanwhile, the ad hoc approach of covert monitoring and reactive containment continues despite its obvious limitations, and the growing evidence of its failure to prevent incidents or protect either humans or the creatures themselves. I have spent the years since my retirement trying to understand not just what these creatures are, but what their existence means for our understanding of the natural world and our place in it. We have constructed a worldview based on the assumption that humans are unique in our cognitive abilities, our capacity for language and abstract thought, our ability to plan and coordinate complex activities. The existence of the creatures challenges that assumption by demonstrating that other species may possess similar capabilities, that intelligence and sophisticated communication are not uniquely human traits. This has profound implications for how we think about consciousness, cognition, and the moral status of non-human animals. If these creatures possess intelligence comparable to that of great apes, do they deserve rights and protections similar to those we increasingly recognize for our closest genetic relatives? The question remains unanswered, largely unasked in public forums because of the official denial of the creature's existence. The personal cost of my involvement in the Michigan investigation has been substantial. The nightmares that drove me to early retirement have never fully resolved. I dream of walking through dark forests, hearing howls that sound almost human, of standing in abandoned houses, finding evidence of desperate last stands, of facing creatures whose eyes reflect intelligence and malice in equal measure. I dream of the families who died in their homes, waiting for help that arrived too late, of the officers who fell defending observation posts against enemies they had not been trained to fight, of the residents who fled their homes and never returned because they knew the official story was a lie. These dreams are not trauma-induced hallucinations, but accurate memories of events that actually occurred, and that knowledge makes them more difficult to process and overcome. My relationships suffered as well. My wife struggled to understand why I could not discuss my work, why I became withdrawn and anxious after returning from Michigan, why I startled at unexpected sounds and avoided wooded areas during our vacations. The non-disclosure agreement prevented me from explaining what I had witnessed, and my inability to share that burden created distance that eventually became unbridgeable. We divorced 2 years after the incidents, and while the investigation was not the sole cause of our separation, it was a significant contributing factor. I lost friendships with colleagues who could not understand my transfer request and interpreted it as weakness or failure. I lost the career trajectory I had worked decades to build, moving from a promising position in major crimes to routine patrol work in a quiet district. The costs of witnessing the truth and being forced to conceal it have been measured in years of diminished life and relationships that withered under the weight of secrets I could not share. Yet despite these costs, I do not regret my involvement in the investigation or my decision to eventually break my silence about what occurred. Truth has value independent of its convenience or the disruption it causes to comfortable narratives. People have the right to know about genuine threats to their safety, to make informed decisions about where they live and how they interact with wilderness areas. The policy of denial serves institutional interests and social stability, but fails in its fundamental obligation to protect citizens through honest communication about risks. My hope in sharing this account is not to create panic, but to promote appropriate caution and to pressure authorities toward honesty about a situation that affects thousands of people living in and around forested regions where these creatures are known to operate. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.